One of the things this chapel is famous for is the bell. John Golden has been ringing this bell since childhood, and if you quiet down, you'll hear him ringing it now. All right, John, I think that's enough.
We just had an unofficial count, 198. Before we actually get started, can you all hear me in the back now? Okay. Very quickly, I have to remind you of the fire exits, one to the rear of the chapel and the other one behind you folks in the reading room. The other thing that you're going to want to know is where the restroom is. So through this opening here and make a quick right, and that will take you to the restroom. Also, please let me remind you to turn your cell phones off. Let me welcome you to tonight to the second of our Fireside Chats for the 2016 series. My name is Sue DiLorenzo, and I'm the volunteer coordinator for the chats, along with John Golden, who is our speaker tonight, and his wife, Gloria. Tonight's topic is meant to be an informal look at Hyde Park's history through the memories of Hyde Park's nonagenarian, John Golden. John is a lifelong Hyde Parker, and with the exception of the years away to finish his college education and to serve in the Air Force, he's been a prominent part of the Hyde Park community for 92 years. He saw it change from a small feudal town where most of the residents staffed and supported the great estates on the river, to break up of the same estates and the development of them into a vibrant town. Many of the stories that John has to share tonight are about growing up in his beloved Hyde Park, living through the transition of the town, and the happenings associated with the residency of the President of the United States in your neighborhood. If you've ever had a conversation with John, little personal accounts of Hyde Park life emerge. Stories of those estate families, FDR, the schools, the war, and even why this chapel is so important to him. We would say, John, who else knows those stories? Have you written them down someplace for Hyde Parkers that will be coming into the town years from now? Of course, the answer was no. So tonight is an effort to capture those personal accounts of history as they happened right here in our own backyard. Unfortunately, as John was organizing his thoughts, he soon realized that he couldn't include all of his stories tonight. So his focus tonight will be on the period up until the end of the war. And we'll just have to save the rest of the stories for a new chat later on, part 2 of Remembering Hyde Park. So please welcome my favorite nonagenarian and friend, John Golden.
Thank you. So I'm a little bit tired from ringing the bell, but I'm also under a whole lot of pressure with all you folks here. I'm pleased to see so many people interested in hearing about old Hyde Park, and I'll do the best I can, but bear with me if I struggle along here a little bit. Now, let me invite you all to my old neighborhood. I grew up 6 houses east of the chapel, on the south side of East Market Street. My father was fortunate enough back around 1920 to buy 3 houses in a row. They were built by a man by the name of Tilley. And he paid, would you believe it? He paid $900 a house for those 3 houses. And he sold 2 of them, and he kept the one in the middle. and we grew up in that $900 house. It was a great neighborhood in those days. It populated with about 24 kids on East Market Street here, and I think they've all disappeared by now, but it was a wonderful place to grow up in Hyde Park. But let me talk about the old feudal hamlet of Hyde Park here. Life magazine back around 1940 had a big splash on Hyde Park and called it a worn-out feudal hamlet that had seen better days. It said it had a rich colonial history, and it had many wealthy estates surrounding it, and it had a bunch of crotchety characters living in town. I probably remember some of those crotchety characters, and I suspect my family was included in those crotchety characters. But I've got a few pictures here to show you how the town looked like years ago when I grew up. If I can manipulate, there's the $900 house that I grew up in on East Market Street. It's still standing out there, and it was a wonderful house, and I just can't believe the price, $900 on that house. But here's a story in Life magazine written about Roosevelt's hometown and the feudal hamlet. They said at that point in time we had 1,000 souls. When I grew up, they always counted that we had about 700 or 750 people living in the hamlet here. And I suspect probably about half of them were my relatives, 2 or 3 different branches of the family. And here's a picture in Life magazine back around 1940, and it shows old Gus Hover sitting on the front porch. That house still stands just next to the post office on the post road. And Gus made the comment that he remembered the days he went down to Springwood to cut the curls on young Franklin's hair. And that was our village barber shop. And north of there was the Dutch Reformed Church, and just north of there it was a residential area. Across the street on the corner, all the activity happened here in Hyde Park, right by the crossroads here, the old crossroads. Across the corner where Cranberries is now was a building owned by the Fraternal Order of Oddfellows. Very strong fraternal order in those days. And they rented the bottom court out to a grocery store, Crapser's grocery store, when I was a kid. It was more like a general store. And the Oddfellows and Rebecca's had the 2nd and 3rd floors. Would you believe it? They had village dinners and card parties up on the 3rd floor of that old building. And then the stairway going up to the 3rd floor was about 2 feet wide. I wonder what would have ever happened. We had a fire in those days. But down the street from there was Zeff's Hotel. It closed down when I was a child, and he moved his holdings down to the post road. And next to that was our only butcher shop in Hyde Park. It was Vanderwater's Market for a number of years, and then the Lasher family took over. Everybody got all their meat from Lasher's Market in those days. And across the street on West Market Street, there was another hotel, the Horning House, and that was torn down in my youth. Gee, there's a great story about the Horning House. I don't know whether it was ever true or not, but the story goes that when General Custer was killed out at the Custer's last stand, they brought him east to bury him at West Point. And the story goes that for some reason or other, he got through Hyde Park here, and they kept his body in a Horning House for a couple of nights. So I don't know if that was his last stand was here in Hyde Park or not, or whether it's a true story or not. But up the street, there was a little house still standing there. Was a fish market for a while. That finally closed. And on the corner was a popular place in town. The only druggist in town was Hopkins Drugstore in those days. Then a man named Ray Hill came to town and bought that business. And he also had a soda fountain connected with the business. And all the drugs in town came out of that building in those days, not all these other places today. But down the post road, let me move this along here, there's Hopkins or Ray Hill's drugstore. It was a nice building in those days. It's a nail shop today. But the next building down there's the old Crapster store and the Oddfellows Hall. North of that was somebody built a little square building and called it the Hyde Park Diner in my early youth, and it was the only place to get a hamburger in town in those days. North of that was the Worden Funeral Home. That eventually burned down too. We had a number of places burned back in those days, but I remember the Worden Funeral Home quite well. Going south, I'm kind of jumping ahead. This was on the corner of Main Street and the Post Road. A picture of our old town hall. Archibald Rogers donated that building to the town. He was a great benefactor to the people of Hyde Park that owned the Crumble estate. Here's another picture of the town hall. But I thought in between here, here we are. We're moving south a little bit. I'm skipping a building, but just between the drugstore and the old firehouse was a building where Senator Sue Serino has her office today. That was the old village post office. And every evening, people used to congregate down to the post office and exchange news of the day. And the mail train came in about 5 o'clock down at the railroad station, and a little short fella, about 5 feet tall, named Hermie Plass, had the contract to bring the mail up from the railroad station. The people used to meet at the old post office, and Hermie would bring the bag of mail up, and they would wait for the mail to be sorted. And if they didn't get any mail, whether they got mail or not, I guess they headed home. But many of them later on that evening would come back down to the village here where the action was and hang out in front of the old firehouse here. They had a number of benches out along the sidewalk, and the fire company was split up into 2 companies in those days. One was Rescue Hook and Ladder Company on the right, and Eagle Engine Company on the left. The president happened to be a member of Eagle Engine Company. But we as youths, we dreamed, we could not wait for the day we became 18, we could get a key to the firehouse. It gave you the key to the front door, and each company had a parlor on the 2nd floor. Beautiful furnished parlor, and you had a key to go in your own parlor. You dare not go in the parlor of the other company. But my family were always members of Rescue Hook and Ladder, so I naturally joined the Rescue Hook and Ladder Company. Many of you remember Helen Fink, a wonderful elderly lady who lived to be 107. Everybody loved her in Hyde Park. And she always told me her first date was with Mabel Dorm, was on the 3rd floor of the old firehouse where they had a dance hall and the village dances took place up on that 3rd floor. They eventually married and lived for many, many years. She lived to be 107 here in the village. Now, there's a row of buildings south of the firehouse. We kind of skipped them here. But Al Zeft owned a whole row of buildings along Route 9. And on the north end, he had a little area, apartment area. And next door, he had a soda fountain. And then he had a restaurant, and he had a saloon. Well, that was a busy spot in town. All the kids in town hung out at the soda fountain, and a lot of the older folks hung out at the saloon. My family was involved in keeping the saloon going. I believe one member of my family. But a lot of action took place at Al Zeft's row of stores. On the end of that row, there was another little village grocery store run by the Bayless family. And then the town hall down Main Street there that I've showed you already. But further down the road, right across the corner, was a beautiful library built by the president's folks, donated to the town. It's still a beautiful looking building. It does wonders for the post road. It's still kept in beautiful condition and still operating. The first village library happened to be right here in the reading room at St. James. And then when the Roosevelt family built that library, they took the reading library out of here and put it in the new library. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, I hope so. That's our old village grade school. And I hate to tell you what happened to that. When the new grade school was built in 1940, we didn't need that school anymore. And they tore it down, and what are we left with? A decrepit looking empty gas station today. Talk about vision. They did in those few years. They didn't seem to be too much. It was a beautiful building, as you can see. A lot of history took place there in that village school. Everybody for generations and generations went to school there. The president's father happened to be the president of the school board for a number of years. We didn't have a school gymnasium in those days, but down a block down, where there's a optometrist today on the top of Main Street Hill, it was an old Baptist church, and they eventually went out of business. And a gentleman owned the state north of Vanderbilt's named John Hyler. He had a candy company in New York named the Hyler Candy Company, and he had an estate and farm up here, and he made milk and transported to New York to make his chocolate candy down there. Well, he did a lot for Hyde Park back in those days, and he built sort of a miniature YMCA out of that building, and brought in some athletic equipment there, and we had our Boy Scout meetings there, and he had boxing gloves, and on the main floor he built a basketball court, and that was the town basketball gymnasium in those days. Our village school had to use that as our village. You go down a block to use that as our gymnasium. Then townsfolk use that for their the local town basketball team. A lot of history happened there at that old school. Gee, I can remember we had a teacher named Miss Schaefer, and I think it was probably about the 6th grade, and she was a good pal of mine. Come about 20 or 12 in the morning in her class, she used to say to me, she called me John Watson. She used to come over to me with John Watson, and her mother lived down on Kirchner Avenue with her. She said, John Watson, hop on your bike and go down Kirchner Avenue. My mother's waiting, got my lunch ready down there. So, gee, that was a thrill to be asked to run down, and the round trip took me about 15 minutes to get down there, and there her mother would be standing with her bag lunch ready for her, and I'd bring it back, get back just about noontime so she could have her lunch and I could go home for lunch. But a lot of things happened at that Hyde Park Village School. Here's the old gymnasium. The Baptist church converted to a village gymnasium. It's in great condition now. The optometrist has it, and he's really fixed it up, and it's in great condition. Here's a picture of our old swimming hole, and Jimmy Rimp's here tonight. The Rimp family owned the property up there. They owned a mill, old stone mill, and they built a dam and dammed up Crum Elbow Creek, and the whole village used to go up there to the trout swimming hole. It doesn't look like much of a swimming hole right now in that picture, but the whole village swam up there. And it was a beautiful old mill. It was operating when I was a child. And sadly, one of Jimmy's relatives decided he didn't want that building to stand there anymore. And a few years ago, that historic old mill, he tore it down. Gee, it was a sad day to see that old Trout's mill being torn down. Further down the creek, you'll go up Route 9 north, and you'll see a pond we always called Sherwood Pond. And that pond was always cleaned out when the Vanderbilt farm was running, and it was like a lake in there. You could go up around the bend and partway up the creek, and they kept it cleaned, and that was a skating center for the whole Hyde Park hamlet. Gee, you take a Sunday when the ice was good, you might have 100 people skating up on that skating pond. They also had an ice house there, Vanderbilt, and I used to go up as a child and watch them cut ice on that pond and store it in that ice house. One day I went fishing up there as a kid, and I saw the biggest copperhead I ever saw in my whole life. There, they loved the sawdust that they used to separate the cakes of ice with, and I think those copperheads like that sawdust. And gee, this was a big fat one all curled up there by the corner of that ice house. Matter of fact, when I was a kid, we had a lot of copperheads around Hyde Park. Gee, when I grew up, we had one in our basement one time. We had one in our garage. They had one down on the post office lawn, and I haven't heard much about copperheads in a number of years, but I suspect there may be some copperheads around town yet, hidden up in the rocks. But they were rather prevalent in those days, the only poisonous snake we had around here. Now let me move on. I got to move up to the Vanderbilt farm. Both my grandfathers worked on the Vanderbilt farm. And my Irish grandfather was a painter up there, and my German grandfather took care of Vanderbilt's horses. And there's a picture of the courtyard. It was kept beautifully when I was a child, and the estate was running, and Fred Vanderbilt was alive. He had the cow barns on the right and the horse barns on the left, and I remember the old bull pen. They had an old bull back in that pen, and we were allowed to go up there and play in the hay mow and run up to take apples out of the orchard, and they had beautiful gardens, and it just was a picture of a farm there in those days. And here's another pic, not the greatest picture, but that's of the farmyard, the barnyard, many years ago. Here's another picture of it, and that was a cow barn, picture of the cow barn. I think they had a herd of Jersey cows, and Vanderbilt bought a big black stallion, Belgian stallion, and I think he bought it from Belgium. And that was his prize show horse. And that's my grandfather there. My grandfather Trout took care of the horses on the Vanderbilt place, and one of his duties was to exercise that big black stallion. And lo and behold, he used to come down through the Vanderbilt woods, down East Market Street out here, and pick me up as a little child. My mother used to heist me up in that wagon. And there wasn't any traffic on the roads in those days, and we would trot that horse up and down all the streets in the village here. That was a thrill to ride behind that big. It looked so much bigger to me as a little kid than it does there in that picture, but it was a prize animal and a pretty mean animal. Matter of fact, it kicked my grandfather one time and sort of broke part of his leg, and he was injured for a bit. But Vanderbilt thought an awful lot of that horse. Let me tell you one other story about the Vanderbilt. My father worked there as a water boy, and he told me the story one day. It was a zero weather, and they were cutting timber back in the Vanderbilt woods for the fireplaces on the mansion and other buildings. And one morning, the superintendent came into the barn up there and told my grandfather Trout, "Don't send team of horses out into the woods this morning. It's too cold. Let's send the workmen out to cut the wood." And I always wondered if they thought more of their animals than they did their workmen in those days. But let me carry on here. Now I got to talk a little bit about the Roosevelt Home Club. Back when Roosevelt was entering politics, let me tell you first when I think I remember back in 1928 when Roosevelt was running for governor. We were having dinner one night out here at our $900 house, and my father said to me, "Bud, grab your coat. We're going in a torchlight parade." And he'd made up a couple torches, old sticks with rags wrapped down around the end of the stick and soaked in oil and kerosene. And he said, "We're going down the street and pick up Uncle Hen, and we're going in this torchlight parade." And I hopped in the back seat of an old Hudson motor car. Down the street we went. We picked up Uncle Hen, and they lit those torches. I think we were at the end of the line in that evening, but I can still see that long line of cars with those torches held out the window. I really don't know where we went. I think we probably went to Statsburg maybe, around the village, and we were going very slowly, and I suspect we probably ended up down at Springwood. But that was in 1928 when Roosevelt was running for governor. This is a picture of the Roosevelt Home Club. There were a group of citizens here in Hyde Park that got together and formed a home club to support FDR and his political endeavors. And that's a picture up in front of the governor's mansion in Albany. Said there were about 150 residents of Hyde Park that went to Albany to have a picnic with the governor. I keep calling him president, with the governor in those days. The governor stands right in the middle. Oh, they tell me I can. They tell me I can spot. There's the president. There's his tenant farmer Mo Smith. Patsy Costello's here tonight. There's Patsy and mother and father right in the front row. There's my Uncle Hen Scriber right there. There's our rector from St. James, Frank Wilson. And there's my aunt and uncle right there standing in that row. And here are the Leonard brothers. Marion Brown. Gee, I can tell you about everybody in that picture. And the Roosevelt Home Club became quite an organization. Every winter, every summer, they used to have a party out on Mo Smith's lawn. He was Roosevelt's tenant farmer. The West Point band would come up here and serenade all afternoon, and all the families would gather on the front of Mo Smith's lawn, and the president would talk to the home folks. And in the evening, they would have the Roosevelt Home Club would support a dance at the old village town hall. That was a March of Dimes in those days, and the band would come into Hyde Park, and you would give dimes in those days to fight polio epidemic, which Roosevelt certainly was aware of. And we'd all gather around about 10 o'clock. The president would speak, and they had a whole radio there, and everybody would stop dancing, and they would gather around and listen to the president's speech on the March of Dimes night. Makes me think of these speeches of the fireside chats. Gee, when I grew up in the 30s, we were Depression people, and all in the same boat, it seemed to me. And the mood of the country was down in those days, and we waited for the president to speak at these fireside chats. I can remember my whole family gathering around an old Atwater Kent radio, waiting for the president to speak, and hopefully to lift the mood of the people in the country. And he would tell us that he had hoped happy days would be here again. And let me continue on here. Now, the Roosevelt Home Club was always invited to the inauguration in Washington. Here's a program my father had from the March 4th, 1933. A group from the Roosevelt Home Club went down to Washington, and it tells in that program they had a specific spot in the inaugural parade set aside for the Roosevelt Home Club, and they had, times were hard in those days, and it was difficult for many of these Roosevelt Home Club members to get the price of a railroad ticket to Washington together, but a few of them did, and a few went down to Washington. They also went down again in 1936. I know my family got involved with relatives that had a cattle farm over in Virginia, and they got involved over there, and they missed the 1936 inaugural parade, and never made it back to Washington in time. But here's a picture down at the old railroad station. We woke up one morning, and my mother said, "Gee, we're going to go down to the railroad station and tell goodbye to FDR going back to Washington. He'd spent a few days in Hyde Park." So we hop in a car, go down to the railroad station, and there are about 50 of us down there or so. And that's a picture of one of my sisters shaking hands with the president. That's me standing by the pole looking the other way, looking at the photographer. But here's another picture. They let the village grade school kids out of school when the president came to vote at the old town hall, and here he is talking to greeting one of the classes from the village grade school. I can identify half those kids in that. My sister's in that picture. I can identify. I don't know anybody here tonight's in that picture. I sort of doubt it, but there might be. Here's another picture, inauguration night or election night down at the Roosevelt home. I got to tell you a little bit about a local election in those days. Gee, they were exciting days. Politics seemed sort of bitter to me, and there hadn't been a Democrat elected supervisor here in many, many years, and my uncle decided to run for supervisor. Well, my father was his brother-in-law, had to help him campaign, and others helped him campaign too. And I'll tell you what they did in those days. And I think each party did the same thing. They gave each of the workers that went out into the country to bring in voters, they each gave him a roll of dollar bills. And I can remember my father having a roll of dollar bills in his pocket, and he headed out in the country, and he'd pass out dollar bills to get people to come in and vote. He even told me he went so far as to bring one fellow in, didn't know how to operate the voting machine. He went in the voting machine, showed him how to vote. But a funny story, one of these election nights, my aunt was helping her husband during election day, and there was an old farm couple up on the crossroad wanted to come down and vote. So she went up on the crossroad and picked up this older couple. And they came down, and they were coming down Hyler Hill north of the village here, and she heard them in the back seat say, "Oh, we only ever vote in the Chickie line or the Republican line." Well, when she heard that, she wheeled right around the middle of the road and headed back on the crossroad and let them out. Didn't want them to. I don't know whether she ever had given them their $2 bills ahead of time or not. Lost $2 on that, but it was funny. But we used to go to the town hall election night, and all the townspeople hung around the town hall while they counted votes and came down to counting absentee ballots in the end. And one night we had a man named Cecil Marshall, nice gentleman in town, was running for road superintendent on a Democratic ticket, and they were counting absentee ballots, and they count one, and the Republicans ahead, and one the Democrats ahead. Came down to the last vote, and they opened that ballot, and Cecil Marshall's name was on it, Democrat. So he was forever after known as One Vote Marshall in Hyde Park. But at the end of the voting those nights, people made up torches. And probably a couple hundred people, including young folks like me, we all got together and paraded down Route 9 to Springwood home, to FDR's home, and he would come out on the front porch and say a few words to the town folks and thank them for all their support. So even though he didn't carry his town, he only carried his own election district. In that first election against Herbert Hoover, FDR lost Maine and Vermont and Dutchess County. So there was I don't know whether you ever heard the slogan, "As Dutchess County goes, so goes Maine and Vermont." They were interesting evening. I got to tell you a little bit about Boy Scouting. The scout troop in Hyde Park was defunct for a number of years. We had a great pastor come at the local Methodist church, and he revived the troop. And I was part of the new troop, and came in 1936, and they wanted to have the first national jamboree in Washington. And there was a polio epidemic, and they canceled the jamboree that year. But 1937, they decided they were going to go ahead with a national jamboree. And gee, the Methodist minister here was our scoutmaster, and gee, he thought quite a bit of me, and he asked me to represent Hyde Park at the first national jamboree of Troop 37. So we had a boy from each town in Dutchess County form that Dutchess County troop, and that's a facade of the front of the Springwood home down here that Western Printing built for us. It's a miniature Springwood home. We took that to Washington with us, and gee, what happened here? Oh, there's Golden right in the front row there. But gee, we go down to Washington. We met in Poughkeepsie and had a very big parade and a band. And gee, Main Street was lined with people in those days sending us off to Washington. We marched down the hill and across on the ferry over the Highland Railroad station, and got on a so-called troop train, and ended up down in Washington. And our campsite was where the Pentagon is now. Well, we set up the campsite there, and the word got out that the president wanted to come visit the Dutchess County troop. And you know, the first thing came to my mind, just as soon as he gets here, he's going to say, "Where's the kid from Hyde Park?" Boy, I got all nerved up. About that. So I hid in the back row, and the president rolled in. He never mentioned the kid from Hyde Park. What a relief that was. That was a wonderful time. Gee, now we move on. Here's a picture of Queen Elizabeth and King George. that was one of the greatest days in town I've ever encountered. The cars came in from the east and they came in from the north and south, and it was total gridlock here. They just couldn't move. They were jammed up on the streets, and many of them begged to get off the road. And I had a little spare land with the home I grew up in, and I had to decide whether to go up to church that day and sing the king and queen up there, the president. The parish gave out 70 passes in those days. And you can imagine the controversy in the parish. Who gets one of the 70 passes? I know I never got one of them, but I could have gone up there and stood outside and watched them, but I decided, what do I do today? Here these cars all want to get off the road, and here's a chance to make a buck. So I piled them in like sardines in my yard and made a good day's pay, but Jimmy Spratt, my neighbor, had about 4 times the land over in his. Gee, he made a big payday that day. I did decide to come down and stand along the post road and watch them come back from church. But in the evening, the word got out that the king and queen were leaving from the old railroad station, and I hopped on my bicycle. I thought I ought to go down and see them off, and I go down there, and about 200 of us gathered around the train that was headed north towards Montreal, and the president drove up with the king and queen, and they said their goodbyes, and the king and queen mounted the train and the platform, and we were all standing around there, and they said goodbye to the crowd, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, somebody started singing Old Lang Syne, and it'll bring tears to your eyes. The whole 200 people sang Old Lang Syne as they headed north towards Montreal, and the war was coming on, and they didn't know what they were really headed for in those days. But it was a wonderful, exciting time in Hyde Park. They had the hot dog roast, and our friend Harry Johansson's mother, Nellie Johansson, was the cook for Mrs. Roosevelt, and she said, Harry, go down to the Mohegan Market and buy the hot dogs. What brand was that, Barbara? Swift's. Go down to the Mohegan Market and buy Swift's hot dogs for the king and queen. They're the best. Harry always told that story. Gee, here's a picture. Well, we had no high school in my day here in Hyde Park, and for 10 years, Hyde Park, or Staatsburg Union Free District, decided to build a school back in 1930 when money was available. They had the vision and foresight that we didn't have, and they built a high school and a complete school building up there, and it's still standing on the road into Staatsburg. But we all had to go to Staatsburg to school, and before, I got to tell you a little story about Staatsburg and Hyde Park. Generations before my time and during my time, Hyde Parkers looked down on people from Staatsburg, and they never said they were going to when you were going north to Staatsburg in those days. You never said you were going to Staatsburg. You were always going to the zoo. That was really awful. That was nasty in those days. And I think that went on till we decided they had send us up to school at Staatsburg, and we were in the same classroom with those kids and played ball with them and on committees with them and such, and got to know them. And that barrier was broken down, and no more do I ever hear anybody say, when I'm going to Staatsburg, I'm going to the zoo. Thank heavens those days are gone. This happened to be our championship high school baseball team. The fellow in the middle was his wife. His wife's here tonight. That's Tommy Gilbert. He was a pitcher, and right next to him, I was a catcher. We won the county championship in those days. Just a word about baseball in those days. Every village back in the 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s had village baseball teams, and Sunday baseball was a big thing in those days, and sadly it's all gone today. I don't know whether we blame television or what we blame, but there is no more local baseball to be had. There's a gentleman named Horton sitting on the running board that car, and his daughter-in-law's here tonight, Mrs. Horton. they're planning the building of the new Hyde Park Central School buildings out on Benny Havlin's farm. There's Benny standing with an old rake in his hand and the animals around, and FDR in his little old Ford discussing where to site the building, and they decided on part of Benny Havlin's farm out there. They bought part of his farm and built three new school buildings in 1940. We left Statsburg then to come to Roseville, and I was in the first graduating class. Let me tell you a little bit about the first day in school. Gee, we got out there in a brand new high school, built like a fort, brand new desks, everything perfectly shiny and new, and 8 o'clock, and I sat down. They put me down at the rear seat in the homeroom, and I must have been nervous. I had a nickel in my pocket in those days, and that was a lot, 1940. And I must have been nervous, and I took that nickel out and I scratched the pencil well, all the varnish off the pencil well. Half hour into a new school building, and the homeroom teacher caught me. She was Golden, come with me. We're going down to see the superintendent and principal. He was both, Mr. Juckett. On the way down the hall, I thought, you dumb cluck, Golden, you're going to be expelled from this school in the first half hour. I got down there and he said, John, sit down. He excused the teacher. He said, well, we've got good reports about you coming from Statsburg High School. But I'll tell you what you did. You destroyed taxpayers' property this morning when you first sat down in that desk. You take that desk and put it back in the same shape it was a half hour ago when you sat down in it. So I thought, boy, what a lesson I learned. Never again have I ever destroyed anybody else's property. That was a great lesson. I took a pal of mine and we sanded and shellacked and varnished that desk to make it look like new, and got myself out of the deep, deep troubles in those days. Oh, let's see. Gee, here's an interesting letter. FDR wrote that to Mrs. Rundle, our school superintendent in those days, about opening a school in education here in the country. And she gave a copy of that to, Orv Todd. He was an East Park boy, and he was a principal of the first new village grade school here. And Orv kept that copy of that letter, and 52 years later, President Bill Clinton came to the school, and Orv showed him that letter, and he wrote on there to Mr. Todd, I'm glad to be here 52 years later. Bill Clinton, 1998, I guess it was. Here's another interesting letter I came across. Executor George, my pal George Briggs' estate, and he had this letter in his files. And it was written from FDR to Henry Hackett, his attorney. And the president was complaining about his assessments and his taxes in those days. Thought property was taxed too high. So the last paragraph, he says, also, if you get a chance to see George Briggs, tell him for the love of Mike to stop calling the Hill Cottage the Dream Cottage. Everybody in town in those days when he was building that house, as a matter of fact, he bought some of the property from George's father, everybody called it the Dream House when he was building it in those days, and I guess FDR hated that term, and he wanted George Briggs, for the love of Mike, to stop calling it that. Fred Vanderbilt died in 1939, I believe, and the property was left to his niece, Mrs. Brugere. She didn't know what to do with it, and she didn't want it. When you believe she put the property on the west side of Route 9 on the market, and I'm sure you can't guess what that price was in 1939. The mansion, the coach house, Bard Rock, the gatehouses, and all that beautiful acreage. She put it on the market for $350,000, could have bought the whole thing. Gee, luckily, I guess no one had any money in those days, and the property didn't sell, and she eventually, thank heavens, gave it to the government, to the federal government, and we have that gem of a property here today in Hyde Park. But I got to tell you about the farm side. Back at that same time the farm side was for sale. It was up towards 400 acres, all those barns, a number of homes, and a beautiful piece, orchards, and cow barns, hay barn, and horse barns, and creameries, dairies, garages, houses. Would you believe that was put on the market for $20,000? Gee, nobody had any money in those. My uncle ended up buying it for $20,000. Would you know the war was coming on and they needed timber for pilings, and there was a lot of good timber on the farm, good timber, good woods back in the Vanderbilt farm. And I think the first year he sold off enough timber for pilings to pay to pay up the $20,000. Unbelievable prices were what a dollar was worth in those days. Gee, this is jumping just past the war, but I got to tell you about the old firehouse over here. That was put up for public auction in 1962. And would you believe that 3-story brick building was auctioned off? We happened to buy it for $17,600 in 1962. It was built for $4,000 in 1900. Well, I needed a new car, and I went across the street to the dealer, and he had a new Chrysler for sale over there for $17,900. And I said to him, gee, how can you justify charging me $17,900 for that new Chrysler when that 3-story brick building went just a few years ago for $17,600? Well, he didn't have an answer for that. But there's a moral to the story. Don't buy automobiles, buy real estate. I think the town has that value at about $400,000 today, and the old Chrysler is gone for many, many years into the junkyard. Now moving on, I got to tell you about a dollar bill. My grandfather, Irish grandfather, lived right across the street here. My father was growing up in that house across the street, and my grandfather used to like to drink. Gee, he kept the local saloon in business, and he was mostly Irish, and he claimed he was little part Indian. And when he got down into Zeph's saloon nights, he became more Indian. He used to come out of Zeph's saloon staggering, waving his arms and yelling "Wahoo!" And he got the nickname in town of being Wahoo Golden. And I'll tell you, it was a little embarrassing for me as a kid. I'd be going down the street, and my grandfather would be coming out of the saloon and pass me by, yelling "Wahoo!" waving his arms. Gee, he went wild with it after he came out of the saloon. But sadly, he was working down on the Vanderbilt coach house down here, and he fell off a ladder and died in about 1935. And we rolled up his work clothes and kept him in our home for a couple of years. And I thought one day, gee, I'm going to unroll his work clothes and see what he might have had in his pant pocket. So I unrolled his work pants, and what do you think he had in his pant pocket? He had a pocket knife and a dollar bill. That's probably about all he had to his name in those days after coming from the saloon. But I thought, what do you do with a dollar bill now as a kid? And I began to think, what should I do with it? And a thought came to my mind. I'm going to put that away in my wallet, and I'm always going to have a dollar bill. No matter where I go, I know I got a dollar bill in my pocket if I get down to where I'd have to spend that. That was 1935 or 6. I carried that doggone dollar bill a long ways, and I never had to spend it. It got so doggone tattered, you can see holes in it now. About 10 years ago, I took it out of my wallet, but I still got that doggone dollar bill, the last dollar bill my grandfather had. Here's a picture. My grandfather, the Golden family across the street. There's my grandfather, Irish grandfather, sitting there with his dog, and my Aunt Caroline, my grandmother, and my father in the middle, and an old gent named Benjamin Dobbs, and a young fella, and my father's brother Henry on the end. Old Benjamin Dobbs fought in the Mexican Wars, in the Indian War of 1850, and came back to Hyde Park. He was a Hyde Parker, and lived with my folks. and told many a story about the Indian Wars and the Mexican Wars, and he became the sexton here at St. James Chapel. He used to spend all of his days out in the reading room telling village people about his exploits out in the West in the 1850s or so. Funny, nobody's smiling in those pictures. They must have not been very happy, I don't know. Gee, here's a picture of my grandmother, the Scriber family in Hyde Park, and I put that in there because in those days they loved Hyde Park just as much as I do. They're waving the Hyde Park banners there, and that's 100 years ago. It's the old timer really, we just love Hyde Park. Here's a picture of our St. James Chapel, and a lot of history has happened here at the St. James Chapel. And I have to tell you, I'm getting near the end of my story. I'll tell you one thing I haven't told you along the way. I got to tell you a little bit about building houses. My father was an enterprising man. He built the Hyde Park Motor Company here about 1920 with 3 other gentlemen. And they were Model T dealers, first Model T dealers here. He eventually sold that and bought a bus line traveling from Red Hook to Poughkeepsie, the Twilight bus line. I don't know whether any of you remember that. And then he eventually sold that and went in the home building business. And he bought Sears and Roebuck houses. You could buy a home in those days from Sears and Roebuck. I understand Sears and Roebuck sold over 70,000 homes in their day across the whole country. Well, I've got some records in the little black book of building homes in those days. You pay about $350 for a building lot. I've got a note in one of my father's black books of a farmer coming in from out in the country with a 2-horse team and a hand scoop and digging a cellar. What do you think you charged in 1927, 28, 29 to dig a cellar? $8. Gee, amazing. Prices. You could buy a house from Sears and Roebuck for anywhere from $1,000 up. I've got the records. One house he paid roughly $2,000 for, and it would be shipped into Hyde Park in a freight car down at the railroad siding, and you go down and bring it up to the building site. And the pieces most of them were all pre-cut. They claim one man could build his own house in those days, but all the pieces were pre-cut and numbered, so it was rather simple to put your own home together. I got a little story about the house in 1929. I was about 5 years old, and my father said to me one day, "I'll take you down on the job with me." Well, I went down and watched him, and he was grading around a house, and he built a house for a man named Mr. Freer. And his last words were, there's a little maple tree out in the front yard about 6-inch diameter, and Mr. Freer said, "No matter what you do, I want that tree saved." Well, my father, in running around with an old iron wheel tractor, nicked the bark, slit the bark about 2 feet off the ground. And I was standing there for nothing to do, and he finally disappeared. I decided I'd go out there, and I started shedding that bark off the tree. Well, he caught me, and a little pat on the rump, and home I went. He said, "No more on the job for you." So he went back with a can of tar, and geez, he tarred that tree and taped it all up and finished the job anyway. Got down to about the last day, and Mr. Freer said, "I've changed my mind, take the tree down." But those were the days of Sears and Roebuck. Before I leave housing, I got to tell you, when I was a kid, I made concrete blocks at home. We had some molds, and the evenings I would pour concrete blocks. And my neighbor Jimmy Spratt, he was a little younger. His son and wife are here tonight. I used to con Jim in to come over to help me. He claimed I paid him 2 cents a block to help make concrete blocks. There are a number of houses still standing in Hyde Park with my concrete blocks holding them up. Oh, now, I think I'm getting near the end here, and let me just check my notes. I think I am near the end, but I've got to tell you a little bit about this organ. That's a Hillborn Roosevelt organ, and it was given to the parish by Walter Langdon in 1885. Hillborn Roosevelt was first cousin of Teddy Roosevelt's. And he had an organ company in New York, and he built, during his young life, a total of 358 organs. This happens to be number 235. Up in the upper church was number 234. But we had the foremost expert on Roosevelt organs come here about 12 years ago and look at this organ. Gee came in the doors through the reading room, and he looked at that organ. He exclaimed, "You have a gem here." And in his words, we have one of the rarest musical instruments in the whole world here that has never been damaged. There's a little damage out in the rear part, in the bellows, but basically nobody has ever tried to remodel that. It's just the same as it was put in 1885. Well, he wrote up a report on it, and it at those days, 12 years ago, it was going to cost roughly $75,000 to restore that into working condition. But he would love to get his hands on that. And he made some other statements that is one of the most beautiful instruments he has ever seen, and the tonal would be beautiful. So someday, I hope maybe we'll get the organ working. Another little story about the organ before I leave. There's an entrance door here on the side of the organ, and it was hand pumped in those days. My father and his sister lived right across the street, and their job most every Sunday was to come over and pump the organ here, and they got a dime a Sunday for pumping the organ. Well, Chuck, they had longer sermons in those days. And during the sermon, there's a chair in there. I think that's been in there ever since 1885. There's a chair in there, and the kids used to fall asleep in that chair. And well, the sermon would finally end after hours, Chuck. And the organist wanted some music, and he'd start pushing the keys down. There wasn't any music, wasn't any air. So he kept a hammer on the bench there. He used a hammer on the front of the organ to wake the kids up to start pumping to get some air going, so he could have some music. But now I'm really near the end now. I've got to tell you really why I love the chapel. It was after the war, and I came home from school one Christmas, and my mother said, we're going to midnight mass here, midnight service at the chapel. So in the meantime, I got to tell you what happened at St. James. Our rector left during the war to become a chaplain in the Navy, and there was a nice gentleman from upstate that left his parish to become a chaplain in the submarine service out in the Pacific. And we had an old gentleman during the war that served as interim priest here. Well, he wanted to retire when the war ended, and our previous rector, decided to stay in Washington at St. John's Church, and we needed a new priest here at St. James. And a miracle, we had a gentleman in the parish that said, I know of a good man that had a parish up in upstate New York, and retired and joined the Navy as a chaplain. He's out with the submarine squadron in the Pacific, but he's going to retire from the Navy, and he's going to be looking for a parish. He said, gee, I recommend we talk to him. And they talked to him, and his name happened to be Gordon Kidd. They hired Gordon Kidd, the church did, as our rector, called him to St. James. And when he first came to town, I believe he made calls on the parishioners, and he stopped to see my mother one day, and he said, gee, the story goes, he said to my mother, tell me about your family, Chuck. And she said, I got 3 daughters and a son. She said, my son, he doesn't happen to like girls. All he thinks about is playing ball all the time. Well, she was only half right there. But anyway, we come to church that evening, Christmas Eve, and I sat back there just where DJ's sitting now in that pew, I think, and the 5 of us, and we had the time mixed up, and we came an hour early, nobody here. I was a little angry with my mother. I said, you sure what the time of the service is? Well, we decided to stay, and we stayed, and finally somebody came in from the reading room, and there was a middle-aged lady with a young lady with her, and I thought, oh, geez, who's that beautiful gal coming into St. James? And I said to my mother next to me, gee, who's that? She said, that's our new rector, his wife and daughter. And I thought, wow, he's got a good look. He has a good-looking daughter there. Well, lo and behold, the next day she left for California, never to meet her, and never planning on coming back to Hyde Park. And gee, a miracle brought her back to Hyde Park. And I came home from school in the summertime, and a pal of mine said, "Get a date, and we'll go out to dancing. Call Gloria Kidd up." And I thought, oh, gee, no. So he conned me into, bugged me, and I called the rectory up, and Mrs. Kidd answered, and I said, "Gee, this is John Golden looking for Gloria. I want to speak to Gloria, your daughter Gloria." She said, "Well, it's a bad time. I tell you, she can't come to the phone right now. She's in the tub." So I said, "Okay, you tell her that I called and that I'll call back again." But I just know how I react. I would have never called back again. And just as I was about to put the receiver down, must have been that close to being put down, her mother said, "Hold on, I'll get her out of the tub." and that was it. And 62 years later, here we are, married 62 years. And I got to tell you one last thing. I married one of the most beautiful people God ever put on this green earth. Thank you very much for listening to me. I hope I haven't bored you. Gee, I'm just about at the hour limit, too. Thank you very much.
We can entertain some questions. If you have a question, just raise your hand, and we've got two people that are walking around with microphones. So,
Sue, let me interrupt you before you ask for questions. You've done such a wonderful job. Did I tell you? I told you about the Roosevelt Home Club. My mother was a perpetual secretary. I still have all the records of the Roosevelt Home Club, and I think I have some privileges left, Sue. I think I can make you, here's a badge, pin the Franklin D. Roosevelt Home Club, and I think I have the privilege and the right to make you an honorary member of the Roosevelt Home Club.
thank you so much.
Do you want to show your pictures?
Pardon me?
Do you want to show your pictures?
Oh, gee.
One more thing.
I did have some. I've got a whole bunch of old newspapers home collected for many years, and Sue's talked me into putting them in some folders here. And gee, I think the first one, I probably didn't tell you. I guess I didn't tell you much about Pearl Harbor. I must have skipped Pearl Harbor, but that was a great day in Hyde Park. Gee, I remember like yesterday. And here's a picture in the Herald Tribune of the Japanese declaring war on the U.S. in December 8th, 1941. Gee, here's another picture of a sad day in Hyde Park. Solemn nation bows in grief that our president has died. And gee, I have many copies of these newspapers. I have to preserve them, give them to the museum. Here's another one about the president dying, and stroke has failed at Warm Springs. And here's a good one. Gee, this cheered the whole nation up. The Germans surrender, war ends in Europe. And I remember that day clearly. But I've got a bunch of other old papers. Someday I've got to protect them and turn them over to the museum. So, thank you.
Okay, now we'll entertain some questions. Just raise your hand and wait until the microphone comes around to you.
Testing.
There's two of them. John, is there another one?
It's good. John, your first question's over here.
John, I don't have a question, but I'm sure you're aware that those Sear houses still stand.
We do.
Norm lived in one on South Cross Road, and Martha Streever's house is a Sears, and there's one down by the cemetery. So they're still standing. It's amazing.
There's two on Kirchner Avenue, and there's one on Buller Lane, my father built. Cheers, House.
That I didn't
They're
know.
all over the place. Cheers, House.
I'm just going to take this off, John, so you can walk around while you're answering questions.
I guess folks have heard enough, John.
Are there any other questions? No?
I've got a lot more stories, but I better not tell them to you tonight.
You want to start with part two?
Thank you.
Do another one of these, I guess. Sorry, turn it on.
Oh, wait a minute, hold on. We have a number of announcements, but first I want to thank John for all that he's done for Hyde Park. He really is Mr. Hyde Park. There are a couple of other things. I want to recognize a few people that have helped with tonight's program. Certainly, John and Gloria Golden, whose inspiration was to restore the chapel, and now after that last story, I think you know why. Randy Soden and John Bickford, who have been helping us with the audiovisual needs for tonight. Herb Sweet is in the rear of the chapel, and he's been recording tonight's lecture. So it will be posted, now correct me if I have this wrong, Herb. It will be on the St. James website, and you'll go to YouTube. So the address is on the back of your program. You'll go to that site, you'll just scroll down. On the bottom of the page will be a little icon that has a picture of the church. It's black and yellow, and then you just click on that, follow the directions. So you'll be able to hear this again, or for any of you who have friends that couldn't come tonight, please tell them that. Also, Barbara Sweet helped John put the pictures together tonight for the program. Bill Urban from the National Park Service was providing some of the pictures. Joanne Lown is coordinating the reception that will follow in a couple of minutes. And then, of course, there are many behind-the-scenes volunteers that help make these chats possible. So we thank all of those people that have been involved with that. We do have a couple of announcements before you leave. Father Chuck Kramer,
Good evening, everybody. And really, welcome to St. James. We're delighted to have you here. If you have not had enough of the chapel and you would like to come back for another series coming up very quickly, not only the Fireside Chats, but as you may know, Lent starts next week, Ash Wednesday. Of course, if you're welcome to come to our Ash Wednesday services, 6:30 in the morning, 10 in the morning, and 7 p.m. But during the Lenten season, we also have a program which will take place here in the chapel on Wednesday evenings starting on February 24th. As you know, on Ash Wednesday, we put ashes on people's heads and say, remember that you are dust and to dust you shall return. The series is all about preparing for death in order to live more fully. And it includes not only the spiritual aspects, but also legal aspects like how do you do a will and all those sort of legal things. How do you deal with a funeral home? And how do you write your own funeral? So if you're interested in that, I have a lot of flyers here, and I hope you will want to come back to the chapel before too long. Thank you.
Thank you. Bill Urban from the National Park Service has an announcement. Bill?
I'll let my wife do the speech.
Oh, okay. There you are.
All right. I hope everyone can hear me. What we are going to have this year on October 4th is a very special event at the Roosevelt home. Mr. Golden talked about the torchlight parades that the town used to have here on election night, and we're going to recreate the torchlight parade on Friday, October 14th. We're actually going to be using the front of the Roosevelt home as a stage. We're going to have live music. we're going to have an FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt impersonator, and the man who is going to be playing FDR looks so much like him that he could be FDR's brother. So we do this every presidential election year for two reasons. One is that the Roosevelts believe that the basic job of every citizen is to go vote. And so it's to encourage people to go vote, regardless of political party, but also it's a way to celebrate the people of Hyde Park. And so we do hope you're going to join us. It's going to be 7 o'clock, October 14th. Put it on your calendar, and we're going to have a really wonderful time. So do come and join us. And Bill, can you think of anything else? Oh, dress in period costume if you like. We'd love to have you do that as well. Okay?
Okay, thank you. Deb Belding has a couple comments about the Hyde Park Community Garden. Deb?
We're having a great winter, that's for sure. Very happy about that. You know, John and Gloria have also been visionaries for this garden. The garden is on the grounds of St. James. It's at one of the old baseball fields. And so when we envisioned bringing a community garden to it, John and Gloria were on board right from the get-go. And I'm just so grateful for their friendship and their support for the garden. So let me ask you a quick question, everybody. Who is 55 years old or older? Please raise your hand. Well, that's great. Good news. Because this year we're going to open up the garden, an area of the garden that is called the Young at Heart Garden. For all you boys and girls, 55 and older, who really would love to do something for your fellow residents here in Hyde Park. Now, there's a lot of people that are in need. And let me tell you, this is our 5th season at the garden coming up. We go and we grow and we donate assorted vegetables and flowers to the Hyde Park Food Pantry every single Friday in season, and also your friends at Meals on Wheels. They get fresh vegetables and flowers from the garden. So join us. We don't care if you're going to be there one day a month, one day, whatever, every couple of months or whatever. It's open for all of you to please experience this. It's a wonderful place to be. It's really magical how this garden has evolved. So we invite you to please spread the word. We're going to hopefully open up on March 17th, Mr. Golden, St. Patrick's Day. We're going to get our peas in. And so please just spread the news around. It would be so wonderful to see all of you. Thank you.
Is there anyone else that would like to? Patsy? Patsy, go ahead. Yeah. Oh, here he comes.
John's
Here he comes.
coming. I'm coming, Patsy. By the way, this lady's name is One Vote Costello. She was elected to the Hyde Park Library Board with one write-in vote.
And when they called me, they said, I don't know whether this is good news or bad. But I did it for 5 years. Anyway, I'm the president of the Town of Hyde Park Historical Society, and I just wanted to tell you that John and Gloria Golden have given us the space in the rescue hook and ladder part of the firehouse. We have our museum there. We'd like you all to come and visit. We're open from June the 1st through the end of October, on Saturdays from 10 to 1, and on Sundays from 1 to 4. And we hope you'll come and visit us. We have the voting machine when FDR ran against Hoover in 1932. We have a display of the MPs when they were here in Hyde Park. And we'd love to have you all come visit the museum. And on May 1st, on Sunday, we have our annual Eleanor Roosevelt Knit-In at the Wallace Center. It's from 1 to 5, where people come and knit or crochet. And we make blocks that we put into afghans, And you're all welcome to come. You don't have to knit or crochet to come, but you need to make a reservation. And in the other room, when you go for refreshments, you'll see these little pink sheets. If you're interested in coming, please take a sheet. Thank you.
Okay, we thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I just want to draw your attention to the programs on the back of your program. The next one, we'll be talking about Hyde Park's historical buildings, and that will be offered by Tony Musso. And so I'm sure that will be pretty much a continuation of maybe not the same stories, but a little more history next time. So we hope you'll join us for that. And we hope that you'll stay a couple minutes and have some refreshments with us. Thank you for coming.